started training Iraqi troops at the beginning of that war, they still don't have a military that's worth a damn. ISIS knows how to fight. The Iran-backed Shiite militias we were just talking about know how to fight. Iraq is the actual country and government there, and they can't get an effective army together in all this time. Why?
Well, because they have no thing to fight for. If you notice, the people who do fight in the Middle East have a cause that they believe in, and it's not just the nation state. The nation state doesn't have a lot of attraction for those people. The nation state's collapsed. There actually isn't a nation state. So if you look at the Kurds in the north, they fight very well. Why? To maintain their homeland. If you look at the Shia militias, they fight very well because they're protecting their part of Iraq. And even the Sunnis up in the Anbar province area, when they were armed by the United States and they had a local militia, they fought very well to liberate their cities of ISIS. And I think all of those groups have to get together, cooperate, because ISIS is a threat to them. You can argue about whether it's a threat to the United States, but it's clearly a threat to them.
All right. Pinnacle event. The plot of your book juxtaposes a South African nuclear program from the apartheid era with the 2016 presidential election.
Right. So the South Africans actually had a secret nuclear bomb program that built nuclear weapons. And before the apartheid regime collapsed and handed control to a majoritarian government led by Nelson Mandela, they said they destroyed the nuclear weapons. No one ever saw that happen. There was no United Nations inspection. So I changed that one little fact in history as the jumping off point. So in alternative history, I say, no, those nuclear weapons were not destroyed. And somehow they were stored somewhere. I don't want to reveal too much of the plot because it is a thriller and there are surprise twists and turns. But the United States becomes aware that those weapons were still around and that someone just bought them. And so a Zulu woman who is the deputy head of intelligence in South Africa works with an American intelligence officer to try to find out who has the bombs. And this is all happening in 2016 while the United States is in the throes of a presidential election. And of course, the Americans think the bombs are coming to New York.
Who are the candidates in this 2016 presidential election?
Well, there's a woman and there's a man.
Are you trying to raise awareness through fiction about any real issues facing the country today, or is this just an alternative history thriller?
No, I try in all of my novels to raise issues, but in a sugar-coated way. So that if you like thrillers, you like page-turners, espionage novels, you can enjoy it. At the end of it, you're going to say, oh, wow, I just learned something. And maybe I need to think more about this because maybe this is a big problem. I won't tell you, because it is a surprise ending, I won't tell you what the issue is. But at the end of the novel, you're left thinking, wow, maybe we ought to do more about this.
Huh. I'm just curious because I didn't see it. What's the name of your fictitious female presidential candidate?
I don't give a name.
Oh, you don't give a name?
No.
Aha. Do you give a name to the male?
No.
Parties?
No, I don't. It's not about the presidential elections. That's happening in the backdrop, and it's affecting the way the people deal with the problem.
With your experience, you could be writing nonfiction books and say directly what you think about world affairs and what the problem is you think we need to be paying attention to that you say is part of the surprise ending. And probably people would pay attention when you open your mouth because you're Richard Clarke. So why write fiction?
Well, I write both. I've written 3 nonfiction books. The last one I wrote was called Cyber War, and I think it was about 4 years ago. And I think it had
You were here.
Yeah, thank you. I was. And I think that book actually had a huge impact, much more than Rob Kanaki, my co-author, and I thought it would have had. I keep being told by people around the world and in Congress and in the military and whatnot that they've read it. So there are subjects I think that have to be exposed in an analytical way, and I write nonfiction about that. But I also think it's possible to convince people more sometimes by showing them an alternative future.
Daniel in Huntington, you're on WNYC with Richard Clarke. Hello.
are you, man?
Good, thank you.
My question is really for Mr. Clark regarding, cybersecurity that he was just referring to. How does he see it today, after 4 years of writing his novel, comparing to the actual physical threats that we're facing that he was referring before as ISIL, maybe North Korea, and others? So how he sees his view on cybersecurity today?
Thank you. There are those who say cybersecurity is the most serious threat facing the nation. Are you in that camp?
Well, cybersecurity is a threat that's actually happened, and some of the other threats we talk about with ISIS attacking the United States are potential future threats. But every day in this country, companies and government agencies are successfully attacked by people from other countries, stealing billions of dollars on an annual basis, stealing all sorts of information. And the truth is, Brian, we can't keep them out. No one is really successful. It's so much easier to get in than it is to do the defensive job and keep them out.
Patrick in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC with Richard Clark. Hi, Patrick.
Yeah, hi. I have a quick question. I wanted to know if Richard Clark has read Michael Morrell's book or heard his statements about the lead up to the war in Iraq, and that there was consensus in the intelligence that Hussein and Iraq posed a threat.
Right, and maybe he did that elsewhere too. He did that on this show last week. Listeners, if you don't know, Patrick is referring to the former CIA director, Michael Morrell, who also has a new book. And Mr. Clark, when he was here the other week, and I was asking him if you knew then what you know now about Iraq, should we have gone in, etc. And he stuck to the line that it was a global intelligence failure, that basically anybody who was considered an expert, with very few exceptions, believed that Saddam Hussein did have or was very close to having the weapons of mass destruction that was used as the basis of the war. So our caller is asking you if you agree that there was really a consensus at that time.
No, I don't, and I value Michael Morrell's opinions, but I think he's wrong on this. The State Department's Intelligence Bureau, which is the contrarian intelligence service most of the time, it certainly was when I was in it, actually dissented from some of the judgments that were made at that time. The question should really be, did the intelligence community think that there was enough of a WMD program to justify going to war over? The intelligence community did not think he had nuclear weapons. They did not think that he had an active weaponized biological weapons program. They said he might have had some old chemical weapons left. They were mainly talking about the potential that he could in the future build nuclear weapons. Of course he could in the future, but he hadn't, and the truth of the matter was he wasn't.
So why do you think, if that's a flimsy reason, why do you think the Bush administration really wanted to go into Iraq? Or was that the reason, that it was just seen as such a priority to prevent that potential future?
Paul Wolfowitz, in a moment of candor, he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, said in one interview, weapons of mass destruction was the only justification that everybody could agree on. That there were different justifications that different people had, but they were all these Bush people, even before they came into office in 2001, they all had in mind invading Iraq for different reasons, different motivations. And what bothers me is that many of these people are the same people who are advising Jeb Bush, including Paul Wolfowitz.
John in Inwood has a proposal for how to deal with ISIS. Hi, John, you're on WNYC with Richard Clark.
Hello, and thank you. This is for Mr. Clark. My question is, why don't we reestablish the border between Iraq and Syria? That was one of the big propaganda victories for ISIS, is when they declared that there was no longer a border, and now that they essentially have an internal communications between their bases in both countries. Why can't we do something like the Union did to the Confederacy, and like in seizing the Mississippi and cutting the two parts in two, and then begin a gradual rollback of ISIS?
Well, that border is not like the Mississippi. It's a sand border. There's no natural boundary there. And neither the Syrian government nor the Iraqi governments in Damascus and Baghdad, have any control out there. They would both dearly like to reestablish control of their border, but neither one of them has the capability of doing it militarily, because that area is now held by a strong and embedded ISIS force.
Robert in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for taking my call. Mr. Clark, a couple of weeks or a month after 9/11, I was on a downtown number 1 train, and you sat next to me. And I looked and I saw you, and it was just very strange because you had been on the news and you know, what had been happening. And I lived 8 or 10 blocks from the site, and I was home that morning. And I looked at you and I made a joke, and I felt safe being on the train next to you, and you laughed. And you said, do you feel safe in New York? And even though 9/11 had just happened, I said, I've always felt very safe in New York. And you looked at me, and I'll never forget this. You said, you should feel safe in New York because the New York City Police Department will keep you alive. But if you have to rely on the federal government for that, you're screwed. You may have not used the word screwed, you may have used another word. But I remember this very vividly, and I've dined out on this story for years. I was wondering, I kind of think I know what you mean by that, but could you explain again, maybe for me?
Well, I was probably quoting Ray Kelly, former NYPD police commissioner, who said that the city of New York can't rely on the FBI. It needs its own intelligence collection capability, its own counterterrorism capability. And under Mayor Bloomberg and Ray Kelly, they built it, and it's very sophisticated and highly capable. And they have not always gotten along very well with the FBI. There are sort of legendary battles in the past, at least, between the FBI and the New York police. And other cities don't have that kind of capability. New York is unique in the United States in having its own counterterrorism capability. And for, I think, good reason, New York mayors and police commissioners have felt they cannot rely on the FBI.
So, Robert, maybe now you have cocktail party chatter for another 15 years.
Yeah, and another safe 15 years. Thank you for your service. You're a great man. We're lucky to have you, Mr. Clark. And thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Keep riding the subway.
Thank you very much for your call. Since your novel is about nuclear arms smuggling, do you have a position on the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, the Iran nuclear deal isn't done. So we don't. I used to do nuclear arms negotiations, and the devil is in the details, particularly on the verification front. And so I want to see the details. In general, however, if we can get a negotiated agreement, that's far better as an outcome if that negotiated agreement is verifiable.
The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, over there, seems to be doing everything he can, at least in public statements, to torpedo the deal. I'm not smart enough at all the layers of his politics to know what he's really after, but he said the other day that they would not accept any kind of intrusive inspection regime. And I don't think you can have this deal without an intrusive inspection regime.
I saw that. He said they will not be allowed on any military installation. And I think he's trying to assuage, if you want to use our terminology, his right wing. He's clearly allowed this negotiation to go forward, and at several critical junctures, he's given it the green light. So I think if we get an inspection regime, he'll let it go.
And as a former counterterrorism expert, the argument I hear most often about why it matters to the U.S. if Iran even has a bomb is that no Iran, even under the mullahs, is going to drop a nuke on the United States. It would be suicide on their part. The world would come get them. It's that they may share those nukes with terrorists who won't bear their fingerprints, which ironically is the exact reason we went to war in Iraq that we were just discussing. Saddam Hussein might get it, share with Al-Qaeda after 9/11, and that was the risk. How much do you assess that scenario as the bottom line risk to the United States?
I think it's a very low probability, but low probability, high impact. If you get that wrong, if you say, well, it's a 1 in a million chance that the terrorists would get their hands on a nuclear device, if you get that wrong, history changes in a very dramatic way.
Richard Clarke's new novel, set around a smuggling of nuclear arms in a 2016 presidential campaign, featuring a female candidate and a male candidate, is called Pinnacle Event. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and your perspectives with us.
Thank you, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Time now for the latest news. Richard Haig has it. Hi, Richard. What's happening?
Hi, Brian. Iraq is appealing for greater international help in fighting the so-called Islamic State. At the World Economic Forum in Jordan today, Iraq's deputy prime minister said militants' recent takeover of Iraq's key city was a big disaster, and he says the country's own forces could not adequately fight. Supporters of President Obama's trade agenda hope to fend off hostile Senate amendments today. Pro-trade senators survived a Democratic-led effort yesterday to block a major trade bill. Now they hope several hours of votes on amendments will clear the way for the Senate to approve fast-track negotiating authority for the president and send it to the House, where another fierce debate awaits. Weather is slowing the cleanup efforts at the site of an oil spill that's fouling a Southern California shoreline. Gusty winds are whipping up waves as high as 4 feet off Santa Barbara County. An onshore pipeline broke Tuesday, spilling an estimated 105,000 gallons of crude oil. An animal rights group says the MTA rejected its ad opposing horse-drawn carriages here in New York. Last month, the transit agency adopted a new rule barring political advertising, but